So I'd like to discuss the concept of light and shadow, or chiaroscuro. And to me, this is the most important fundamental concept to understand in painting. And basically, we're talking about chiaroscuro, we're talking about light and shadow. So I'm going to use a sphere as an example. I can draw a circle. And we'll have a single light source coming up from this direction here. So just imagine, if you will, this single light source, and it's shining in this direction. And when the light hits the sphere, the object or the form, whatever that form may be, will divide into a light side and a dark side, light and shadow. So I'm going to start to show where that shadow is on the sphere. We have a light side on the sphere. This is all in light, and this is the shadow side of the sphere. And when that light hits the sphere or any object, that object will cast a shadow. So we'll have to sort of draw in a shadow, an ellipse, indicating the shadow that's being cast. I'm just making this all up. I'm not working from any reference, or I'm not observing anything. Just so the cast shadow then will be cast in this direction. Like so. All right, so you have the light side, which is this area here, and we have a shadow side, which is this here, and then the cast shadow. And the shadow can basically be divided into there's two shadows. One is the form shadow. This here, the shape here, that's part of the actual sphere itself, is the form shadow. And then this that's cast beneath it from the light source that's then coming from the sphere is the cast shadow. So you have a cast shadow here, and you have the form shadow here. All right, so let's examine the light side of the sphere here, and that would be relegated to just this area here. I'm going to use a brush to kind of clean it up a little bit. Okay. So the brightest part, we can divide this area in the light side, this sort of oval, into 3 values. And those 3 values are going to be highlight, which would be located about right here. Because this is where the sphere is hitting, the light is hitting the sphere directly. So this would be the very brightest part of the sphere, the highlight. bear with me. And then, so as this is going to be the brightest part of the sphere, oh, by the way, I toned this canvas with a little bit of gray, which creates the mid-tone. So what we have, the three values that we can basically break this down into is the highlight, which I just indicated would be indicated here. And then we'd have halftone. And the darkest halftone is usually where the sphere turns, where the light turns to shadow. So that would be right here. Halftone. Halftone refers to the darkest value on the light side. And that usually occurs where light turns to shadow. And then finally we have, we do also have some halftone here, because at the edge of the sphere, it starts to get a little bit darker compared to the highlight. And then finally we have the midtone, which is the color of the canvas itself. So we have midtone, and I would indicate the midtone to be, I'll just put it right there. So the light side of the sphere can be divided, worked in with basically just three values. Highlight here, halftone, and midtone. But let's put in the halftone so we can actually see it. So as I mentioned, it'll be a little bit darker. This will be the brightest part of the sphere, which is the highlight, and then it'll get a little bit darker as it edges toward the edge of the sphere. And actually, that's way too dark. Not that I'm not actually trying to render this thing, but that's a little better. And then, of course, the halftone will be, as I mentioned earlier, at the edge of the sphere, right here, where it starts to turn into shadow. Take some of the value right there, and so it's starting to turn into shadow. It gets a little darker right here at the halftone. But I'm also softening this edge, which will be important. Okay, so let's reinforce that again. So the halftone will be located right here. This is all the darkest halftone. Also, halftone is located at the edge of the sphere of the form. And again, the highlight is located here. And wherever we see the gray itself, that would be the midtone. Okay, so let's examine the shadow side now. On the shadow side, we have the form shadow, which the edge of a form shadow is always soft. So I did that here, indicating the form shadow is with a soft edge where light gradually turns to shadow. It's a soft edge, a form shadow. So this is a form shadow. Form shadow. which yields a soft edge. And then we have the cast shadow here. Which yields a sharp edge. So that's the contrast. You have the sharp, soft edge of the form shadow, and then you have a sharp edge of the cast shadow. So let's make sure that cast shadow is, this shadow here is sharp. The edge is sharp. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, so we have the form shadow and we have the cast shadow. And again, the cast shadow yields a sharp edge. Now, speaking of edges, I just mentioned that there's 5 values. You can break it down into 5 values, and those 5 values are highlight, midtone, and halftone. So on the light side, there's 3 values: highlight, halftone, and midtone. On the shadow side, there are essentially just 2 values. There's shadow, which is this shadow that I've established. And reflected light. Now, reflected light is light that is bouncing off other areas. Here's the light source here, and as it starts to hit the ground or other objects, it reflects back into the form shadow. So it gets a little bit lighter than the cast shadow and the core of the form shadow. So it'd be a little bit lighter here. Now the trick is not to go too light, because you don't want the reflected light to appear darker, or lighter, should I say, than any of the values on the light side of the form. But then the light here, it's bouncing back in, and it's basically lightening this area slightly. Okay, so that area here is where the reflected light falls. So again, let's go over that. Essentially, there are 5, you can break it down into 5 values, and this is true if we're doing a portrait or a figure. And those 5 values on the light side, 3 of them: halftone, highlight, midtone. On the shadow side, 2, just shadow and reflected light. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5 values. There are essentially 4 edges. We have the form shadow, which yields the soft edges. Now this is all in your handout, the lecture that I shared with you all. Edges, there's 4 of them. 1 is the soft edge, which basically describes the edge of the form shadow. 2 is the sharp edge, which describes the sharp edge of the cast shadow. 3 would be a firm edge. And a firm edge is where, I can't give you an example on this sphere, but it would be where it's still the edge of a formed shadow, such as the bridge of a nose, but because of the bone, it's a rather much more firmer or abrupt turn of form. As a result, the edge is a little firmer, a little sharper. Not as sharp as the cast shadow, but still sharper than a sphere, the formed shadow of a sphere. So that would be firm. And then the last edge, which is probably the trickiest edge, is the lost edge. And the lost edge occurs where two values are so similar we can't see the separation. So on this sphere itself, I would say I could play with the idea that maybe as the sphere is reaching the very edge, we actually lose part of the sphere itself, let's say here. Well, that's not working so well, but I'm going to use this and see if that, yeah, there we go. So literally the sphere loses itself into the background. Now you could also do that with the dark, where there might be a dark value behind the sphere. Like here, or it could basically lose itself into the background, dark into dark. So that would be the lost edge. So this is kind of a mess here, but basically this is what the basic concept of what the handout I gave you is illustrating. And I can't emphasize more how important this is to understand. Now, the understanding of this is really not in the intellectual understanding. It's really in the doing. It's where we have the portrait or the figure, and we're able to interpret it in this manner. And the most important first step would be to separate the light and the shadow, this light side and the shadow side. And that is probably accomplished the best by squinting at your subject or form, whether it's a still life or whether it's a figure, squinting and then to see the values, and then to delineate the edge of the form. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Let me know if you have any questions. Hopefully you can see all these writings and such, but it's all basically covered in the handout that I gave you guys, the lecture, the email lecture that I shared with you. All right, now the next trick now is to apply this to the human figure and portrait. Thanks.